No shirt. No money. No service. Now leave. The barista's voice cut sharply through the cafe as the man grabbed his duffel bag and hobbled toward the exit. Eyes followed him. A few chuckled. Not a single person intervened. But exactly at 8 a.m. the next day, 5 military trucks rolled in and blocked off the street, and the same man who'd been thrown out walked forward, dressed head to toe in uniform. Have you ever watched someone get shamed just because of how they looked? If so, press 1. This is Uncovered Tales. Let's dig into what actually happened. Henry Lawson hadn't meant to step into the cafe that day. At 61, with a back that ached from every march he'd ever done and every comrade he'd ever carried, he preferred to stay unnoticed. But a sudden, relentless downpour left him with no other option. The trendy cafe downtown was the only dry spot within his limited walking range. He paused at the entrance, rain dripping from his silver beard and threadbare army jacket. His worn duffel bag, olive green and falling apart at the seams, hung heavily from his shoulder. He stood there for a moment, sensing instantly how out of place he was among the polished wood tables and patrons hunched over sleek laptops. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee and buttery pastries filled the warm interior, a stark contrast to the cold, soggy discomfort clinging to his socks and boots. Henry exhaled deeply and stepped inside, quietly making his way to a small table in the corner, away from most of the crowd. A young barista with perfectly styled hair sauntered over, looking Henry up and down, his disapproval barely hidden. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't eager to. "Just some water, if that's all right," Henry replied softly. "I'll wait for the rain to pass." The barista raised his eyebrows. "There's a minimum purchase if you want to sit. This isn't a shelter." Henry nodded and carefully reached into his pocket with stiff, aching fingers. "I can buy a small coffee, then." He placed 3 crumpled bills on the table, nearly half of what he had left to his name. The barista didn't move to take the money. "That won't even cover our cheapest roast," he said, his voice now louder, intentionally loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "No purchase, no seat. This isn't a shelter." The cafe fell silent. Conversation stopped as everyone turned toward the unfolding scene. Henry could feel their eyes, just like he had so many times since coming home. The pain they didn't see never stopped hurting. "I understand," he said quietly, slowly rising to his feet. "I'll wait under the awning outside." As he reached for his duffel, a man in a tailored suit at the next table sneered and loudly announced, "He stinks. Can't you smell him?" A wave of laughter passed through the cafe. Henry didn't look up. He kept his focus on gathering his belongings, the same bag that had been with him through 2 deployments, 3 operations, and more nights under bridges than he cared to remember when his disability checks didn't stretch far enough for both rent and meds. The barista moved out from behind the counter now, openly aggressive. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're upsetting the customers." Henry didn't object. He never did. Arguing cost more energy than he could afford. He started limping toward the exit, but the barista wasn't willing to wait. In one swift motion, he grabbed Henry's arm and yanked him toward the door. Caught off guard, Henry stumbled. His duffel hit the floor hard, spilling its contents across the smooth concrete. Among the scattered items was a mesh pouch, and inside it, something gleamed, the unmistakable shape and ribbon of a purple heart. A woman nearby froze mid-sip, her coffee cup paused in midair. For a moment, she seemed to realize what she was seeing, but quickly turned her eyes away, choosing silence over involvement. Whether the barista saw it or didn't care, no one could say. He shoved the belongings back toward the bag with his shoe and shoved it at Henry. "Pick up your things and leave." Henry lowered himself to the floor, each movement strained with pain, and carefully returned the metal to its pouch. His actions were slow, deliberate, somehow retaining grace even in disgrace. No one in the now crowded cafe made a move to help him. He stepped back into the relentless rain, clutching the Purple Heart against his chest beneath his coat, shielding it from the storm. Behind him, the cafe door closed with a sharp, final click. If you believe that respect shouldn't be tied to someone's appearance, stick with us. This story's for you. The rain didn't ease up. After standing beneath the awning for 20 minutes, soaked and stiff, Henry decided to make his way to a small park 2 blocks away. At least the old gazebo there might offer better cover. Each step down the sidewalk was a painful negotiation between willpower and aching joints. The park, for once, was completely deserted. The downpour had cleared out the usual morning walkers and wandering teens. Henry made his way to a dry corner beneath the old wooden gazebo and gently lowered his duffel to the ground. Finally alone and sheltered, he unzipped the bag and checked inside. Thankfully, the rain hadn't soaked through the canvas, his few belongings were still safe and dry. He reached for a familiar mesh pouch and pulled out his Purple Heart, the medal he'd earned after a helicopter extraction went horribly wrong in Afghanistan. It caught a dim sliver of daylight breaking through the cloud cover, its purple center glowing faintly against the rain-muted backdrop, the silver trim gleaming around the edges. Next, he carefully removed a folded American flag, tucked inside a clear plastic sleeve. It was the same flag that had once covered his best friend's casket, later sent to Henry by the man's family, along with a note that read, "He would have wanted you to have this. You were more of a brother to him than we ever were." At the bottom of the duffel lay a weathered photograph in a simple wooden frame. 12 men in desert fatigues, arms locked around one another's shoulders, stood smiling in front of a transport chopper. Henry gently brushed dust from the glass with his thumb, staring at faces long etched into memory. Only 5 of them had made it back. Finally, he pulled out an envelope containing a letter from his daughter, Lily, the most recent of her monthly updates. Their relationship had been fragile since his return from service. His PTSD. Her pain over his absence. His struggles to stay employed or housed. Still, she wrote to him, never missing a month. The words were always formal, carefully chosen, but she hadn't disappeared. "Ray. Alpha 9. Is that you?" The voice snapped him out of thought. Henry glanced up and saw a man approaching through the mist, clad in a battered coat, pushing a shopping cart full of weathered bags. "Eddie." Henry narrowed his eyes, recognizing the face of a fellow vet he used to see now and then at the VA hospital. Eddie stepped slowly onto the gazebo platform, his limp betraying the same kind of war-worn damage. "Figured that was you," Eddie said, lowering himself onto the bench with a familiar grunt. "Been a minute since group." Henry nodded slightly. He had stopped going to the support meetings after losing his apartment, too embarrassed to show up after falling through the very cracks those programs were meant to catch. "You still in touch with your daughter?" Eddie asked, rubbing his knee. "No," Henry replied. "She's in college now. Doing all right." Eddie glanced at the duffel, then back at Henry. "Does she know, about all this?" "She doesn't. And she won't." Henry's voice was firm, shutting that door before it could be opened. "She's doing well. Finally finding her own path. I'm not going to drag her into this." Eddie nodded slowly. It was a decision many of them had made, protecting loved ones from the truth of how life after service had unraveled. Then Henry's old flip phone buzzed, a rare occurrence. The small screen blinked with a new notification. Something trending. He usually ignored anything internet-related, but the throb in his lower back begged for distraction. He clicked the link. The video loaded quickly. And there it was, his own face, on screen, being kicked out of the cafe. Whoever recorded it had added commentary, taunting him through the captions. "Homeless vet drama. Watch this freeloader get served." It had already gone viral. Thousands of views. Hundreds of cruel comments. Many doubting whether he'd even serve at all. Meanwhile, across town, inside a suburban home, a man named Eric Daniels scrolled through his phone while half listening to a dull conference call. The algorithm tossed a video onto his feed. Homeless veteran drama. He clicked, bored. Seconds later, his expression drained of color. Sergeant Lawson, he muttered under his breath. Without a word, Eric stood up, exited the virtual meeting, and walked out, leaving coworkers staring at his empty seat. He hadn't forgotten. He couldn't. That sergeant had carried him for 2 miles over jagged mountain terrain after an IED tore their convoy apart, and shattered Eric's leg. The same man had gone back into the fire zone to pull 3 more soldiers out, despite his own spinal injuries. In fact, those injuries had ended Henry's military career. But when the discharge paperwork came through, the extent of his damage had been quietly minimized by the system. Eric's hands trembled as he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Steve, it's Eric. Have you seen what they did to Sergeant Lawson?" By the time night fell, the video had spread like wildfire across private veteran forums nationwide, and the tone there was nothing like the internet mockery. Phones buzzed to life. Texts flew between former units. Quiet fury turned into coordinated action. Meanwhile, Henry, completely unaware of the storm building behind the scenes, spent the night stretched out on a bench in the park. His duffel served as both his pillow and his safeguard. His Purple Heart, pressed to his chest beneath his jacket, felt less like a medal and more like armor. He didn't beg. Didn't shout. He just walked away, with a decorated heart in his pocket and cold rain soaking through his shoes. Have you ever seen someone look down on just because of how they appeared? Type dignity. We're listening. As dawn crept over the city, the sky was surprisingly clear, washed clean by the storm from the day before. Henry woke with the rising sun, just like he had every morning since his earliest days in boot camp. Every movement ached. The damp chill had settled deep into his bones overnight. He made his way to the public restroom nearby to splash water on his face and brush his teeth, doing his best to hold on to a sense of dignity, despite his circumstances. Even in homelessness, his discipline showed, in how he folded each item in his bag, how he packed his few belongings with quiet precision. Across the street, the cafe began waking up. The same barista who had kicked Henry out the day before was busy setting up chairs, humming casually, completely unaware of the man he had publicly humiliated. Customers began to wander in, ordering their lattes and espressos while scrolling through morning news feeds. No one noticed the first military truck until it came into view, rumbling to a stop right in front of the cafe. Its diesel engine made the windows tremble. Then came another truck. And another. Within minutes, 5 army transport vehicles had surrounded the block, drawing confused looks from passers-by. Patrons inside the cafe pressed up against the glass, trying to make sense of the sudden appearance. The barista froze, still holding a coffee pot mid-pour, as one by one, uniformed men and women began stepping out of the trucks. It was clear they weren't active duty, their ages varied, and their uniforms spanned decades of service. Some wore desert camo from the Iraq and Afghanistan eras, others wore the classic green fatigues from conflicts long past. Each one bore patches, pins, and ribbons, a visual history of service and sacrifice sewn into fabric. At the front of the group stood Lieutenant Colonel Nora Bennett. Her salt and pepper hair was tied into a no-nonsense bun. Her uniform was crisp, clean, and radiated authority, even after a decade of retirement. She stepped forward with the presence of someone used to command. "Attention," she barked. Immediately, 50 veterans clicked into formation, their posture sharp, creating a solid line that stretched the entire block. People poured out from nearby stores, phones held high, capturing the surreal moment. Drawn by the noise, Henry approached from across the street, his eyes scanning the scene in confusion, then widening as he began recognizing faces. Old squad mates. Battle buddies. People who had once fought beside him. Colonel Bennett walked forward, her voice clear and firm, as she addressed the crowd now gathering in stunned silence. Yesterday, at this location, she said, her tone unwavering, a man was kicked out and humiliated, based solely on how he looked. She raised her arm and pointed across the sidewalk. That man, she declared, is Sergeant First Class Henry Lawson, former commander of Alpha 9 Rescue Team, 10th Mountain Division. Gasps and whispers rolled through the crowd. The barista who had insulted Henry turned pale, the blood draining from his face. Colonel Bennett kept going, her voice rising over the murmurs. This cafe refused service to a man who once carried 4 wounded soldiers on his back, under enemy fire, after an IED destroyed their vehicle. He refused to leave until every last member of his unit was accounted for. His actions left him with permanent spinal damage. Damage that, to this day, the VA has failed to fully acknowledge. She nodded, and 2 veterans stepped forward with a large wooden sign in their hands. They planted it right outside the cafe entrance. It read, "This place refused a hero. We remember." The crowd stood in still silence. Phones lowered. The weight of what they were witnessing finally began to sink in. The barista stepped out of the cafe, his face burning red with embarrassment. I didn't know," he stammered. "How was I supposed to know? He never said he was a veteran." Colonel Bennett met his gaze, calm but firm. "And that, son, is exactly the issue. Real heroes don't broadcast who they are. They don't parade their medals. They carry the weight of what they've seen, quietly, and ask for nothing in return." From the back of the crowd, Henry slowly made his way forward, his limp pronounced but steady. The veterans standing at attention immediately stepped aside, forming a respectful path for him to walk through. Though his clothes were worn and his face unshaven, Henry's posture held a kind of quiet strength. There was a gravity about him that commanded respect without a single word. "This really isn't necessary," he said softly to Colonel Bennett. "I'm not worth all this fuss." She turned to face him fully and raised her voice for all to hear. "With the utmost respect, Sergeant, you don't get to decide your worth. Not to us." The barista stepped closer to Henry now, visibly rattled. "Sir, I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. If I had just known." Henry lifted a hand to stop him. "Don't say sorry to me," he replied, his voice low and rough but steady. "Say it to the uniform. Say it to every man and woman who's ever worn it, whether you recognized it or not." At that moment, Eric Daniels stepped forward from the line of veterans. His dress pants didn't quite hide the prosthetic leg he walked on. "Sergeant Lawson saved my life," he said to the crowd. "I was a 20-year-old kid, bleeding out in the mountains. He carried me 2 miles, while suffering from a spinal injury of his own. Then he went back, and pulled out 3 more of us." One by one, more veterans stepped up, not all sharing stories about Henry directly, but each one speaking to the unspoken brotherhood they shared. Stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and wounds that didn't always show on the surface. Inside the cafe, employees scrambled to pull down the "no shirt, no service" sign from the window. The manager came out, offering complimentary coffee to every veteran present. Colonel Bennett gave a polite but firm shake of her head. "We're not here for coffee," she said. "And we're not here for apologies. We came because when one of us is treated with disrespect, all of us feel it. Too many of our brothers and sisters have faded into the background after taking off the uniform. We're here to remind you they're still here." By midday, the military trucks rolled away. But the moment they left behind didn't vanish so easily. Henry now found himself surrounded by people who had once stood beside him in a different kind of battlefield. Each one offering help, some insisting on it. His duffel was loaded into Eric's car. Plans were made to retrieve the rest of his things from the storage unit he hadn't been able to afford in months. And online, the narrative was changing. The cruel video that had once mocked him was now buried under footage of the veterans' peaceful stand, circulating with hashtags like #RespectTheUniform and #InvisibleHeroes. Not everyone had seen the medal. But now, they saw the man. 1 week later, that same cafe looked, and felt, very different. A bold new sign hung in the window. Respect all. Ask before you judge. The staff had completed a round of sensitivity training. A permanent discount program was set up for veterans and first responders. Henry never went back, even though the owner personally invited him several times and sent handwritten apologies. He didn't need to return. He'd chosen instead to walk forward, with quiet grace, rather than retrace the steps of that painful morning. The apartment Eric and the others had arranged for him was small, but it was clean, quiet, and his. A modest one-bedroom in a mixed-income building with an elevator, no more stairs for his injured spine to climb. For the first time in over a year and a half, Henry slept in a real bed. Behind a real door. With a stocked fridge full of food that hadn't come from a shelter. It was still hard for him to accept help. Years of military culture and survival had taught him that asking for support felt too close to weakness. But every morning, someone showed up. A different veteran would be waiting in the building's lobby, sometimes a familiar face, sometimes a stranger bound to him by shared service, offering to bring him breakfast or drive him to a VA appointment. Meanwhile, the cafe quietly evolved into something else, a space that veterans now claimed in quiet solidarity. They showed up every day, sipping coffee at the same corner table where Henry had once been turned away. They didn't talk about what happened. They didn't need to. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence alone, quiet, steady, spoke volumes. A silent reminder that even when they're overlooked, they are still there. One morning, a young father took a seat near a group of 3 veterans, his son, maybe 7 years old, beside him, legs swinging under the chair. The boy stared with open curiosity as the men stood, exchanged a sharp salute, and sat down together. "Dad," he asked, his voice clear enough for others to hear, "why do they salute if there's no flag?" The father paused for a moment, aware that the veterans had heard. Then he replied gently. "Because sometimes, a man is the flag." The veterans nodded with quiet approval. One of them offered the boy a small, genuine smile, perhaps the first he'd shown in public since returning home from his last deployment. Across town, Henry was seated on a bench in a small park near his new apartment, going through a pile of forwarded mail, most of it VA forms and bills. But tucked between the envelopes was one that made him pause. It was handwritten, and instantly recognizable. Lily's script. He opened it slowly, unfolding 2 pages filled with his daughter's careful handwriting. "Dear Dad. I saw the video. The one from the cafe. And the part where the veterans showed up for you. I knew it was you the second I saw your face. Why didn't you tell me things had gotten that bad? All those letters, all those months, and not once did you say you were homeless. You talked about moving around and checking out different neighborhoods. And I believed you. I've withdrawn from college for now, please don't be mad. I can go back later. But right now, I'm coming home. You've never been alone, Dad. Not really. For years I was angry that you weren't around when I was growing up. But now. I get it. I understand what you were carrying. And what you still carry. Let me carry some of it with you. I love you. Lily." Henry read it once. Then again. Carefully, he folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. And for the first time since everything happened, something inside him cracked. A single tear slipped down his weathered cheek. He wiped it away before it reached his chin. His phone rang, the old flip phone he still kept, despite Eric trying to get him on something newer. "Bennett," he answered. "The housing's more than enough. You don't need to keep checking in." "That's not why I'm calling, Sergeant," came her voice. "The mayor wants to launch a veteran outreach program, real support, permanent housing, tailored jobs, disability-aware services. The whole package." "That's good news," Henry replied cautiously. "Hope it works out." They're hiring. Paid roles. I submitted your name. Henry's instinct was to decline. Reflexively. Before you say no, Bennett cut in. Think about how many out there won't have 50 vets show up when they're humiliated. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about them. Nearby, school children had begun to flood the park after dismissal, laughing, shouting, completely unaware of the weight the adults around them carried. Henry watched them for a while. My daughter's coming home, he said at last. That's the best thing I've heard all week, Bennett replied. Bring her to the meeting. Let her see what you're building now. That evening, as the sky melted into warm oranges and soft purples, Henry picked up the phone and dialed his daughter's number, the first time he'd called in years. Can't wait to see you, he said when she answered. And I think I might have found something worth showing up for. Back at the cafe, the evening shift was winding down. The barista who had once kicked Henry out was wiping tables when an elderly man in a faded coat walked in. The barista froze. His new training clashed with his instinct. Before he could speak, one of the regular veterans stood up and walked over. Vietnam? He asked, pointing to the pin on the man's jacket. The newcomer nodded once. Come sit with us, the vet said, motioning toward their table. Coffee's on me. The barista quietly stepped forward and placed a fresh pot of coffee on the table. No one had asked. The lesson hadn't come from a manual. It had come from witnessing something unshakable. The bond between those who served. The quiet power of respect. Outside, night settled over the city like a blanket. Life moved on. People bustled home. Streetlights blinked on. But something, however small, had shifted. The unseen were beginning to be seen. The overlooked were no longer forgotten. And in his new apartment, as he prepared for Lily's return, Henry finally unpacked his duffel for good. He placed his Purple Heart on the nightstand, where he could see it each morning. Not as a reminder of suffering, but as proof of worth. Some people wear their medals proudly on their chest. Others keep them tucked in pockets, because they know the world stopped noticing. But the moment one person stands up, an entire army might rise behind them. Have you ever judged someone by appearance, before you knew their story? Tell us in the comments. We're here to listen. Subscribe to Uncovered Tales, where silence ends, and respect begins.